Listen carefully. Some doors are locked to keep danger out. Others are locked to keep a truth from escaping. In the summer of 1746, on a stretch of Mississippi soil so heavy with humidity it felt like the sky itself was pressing down, there stood a plantation house with a door no worker was ever allowed to open. Not because it was guarded, not because it was marked, but because no one who lingered near it was ever seen again. You were never meant to hear this. The air around that door carried a different weight. Men who could endure the lash without flinching would lower their eyes when passing the rear alcove. Women who had buried children without tears would quicken their steps, as if something behind that oak barrier could smell hesitation. It was not nailed shut. It was not chained. It was simply understood. And that is how real power operates, not through spectacle, through silence. The owner of that estate understood something most men never learn. Fear is strongest when it is undefined. When punishment is visible, resistance can organize around it. But when consequences are vague, when a man simply falls ill, when a woman is sent away, when a name vanishes from the ledger without explanation, the mind becomes its own prison. Think about that. A locked door with no written rule, no posted warning, and yet absolute obedience. That is not physical control. That is psychological architecture. The workers whispered about many things in the quarters at night. Weather, croups, rumors of revolt upriver. But never about the door, not even in jest. It was as if language itself refused to approach it, because deep down they understood. Some secrets are not hidden by walls. They are hidden by conditioning. And if you believe this story is only about one plantation in 1746, you are already missing the lesson. This is about systems, about institutions, about the quiet agreements men make with power in exchange for survival. The door stood at the rear foundation of the house, dark oak reinforced with iron bands, facing away from the cotton fields as if ashamed of what it concealed. No windows overlooked it, no path led directly to it. It existed in shadow, and shadow, my friend, is where the real machinery of control is built. Listen carefully. Some doors are locked to keep danger out. Others are locked to keep a truth from escaping. In the summer of 1746, on a stretch of Mississippi soil so heavy with humidity it felt like the sky itself was pressing down, there stood a plantation house with a door no worker was ever allowed to open. Not because it was guarded, not because it was marked, but because no one who lingered near it was ever seen again. You were never meant to hear this. The air around that door carried a different weight. Men who could endure the lash without flinching would lower their eyes when passing the rear alcove. Women who had buried children without tears would quicken their steps, as if something behind that oak barrier could smell hesitation. It was not nailed shut. It was not chained. It was simply understood. And that is how real power operates, not through spectacle, through silence. The owner of that estate understood something most men never learn. Fear is strongest when it is undefined. When punishment is visible, resistance can organize around it. But when consequences are vague, when a man simply falls ill, when a woman is sent away, when a name vanishes from the ledger without explanation, the mind becomes its own prison. Think about that. A locked door with no written rule, no posted warning, and yet absolute obedience. That is not physical control. That is psychological architecture. The workers whispered about many things in the quarters at night. Weather, croups, rumors of revolt upriver, but never about the door, not even in jest. It was as if language itself refused to approach it, because deep down they understood. Some secrets are not hidden by walls, they are hidden by conditioning. And if you believe this story is only about one plantation in 1746, you are already missing the lesson. This is about systems, about institutions, about the quiet agreements men make with power in exchange for survival. The door stood at the rear foundation of the house, dark oak reinforced with iron bands, facing away from the cotton fields as if ashamed of what it concealed. No windows overlooked it, no path led directly to it. It existed in shadow, and shadow, my friend, is where the real machinery of control is built.
At first, they thought he was praying. That would have made sense. When a man stands alone in the dark, head tilted slightly toward a sealed door, lips barely moving, it is easier to believe he is speaking to God than to imagine he is listening for something else. But Elijah was not praying. He was memorizing. The plantation had a rhythm. Every system does. Footsteps along wooden corridors, the scrape of chairs across dining room floors, the low murmur of the master's voice after brandy, the sharper tone of the overseer when numbers didn't align with expectation. Most men heard noise. Elijah heard patterns, and patterns are power. Night after night he stood near that door, lantern dimmed, eyes half closed as if resting, but his mind moved with precision. He counted how many times the master descended the back staircase. He tracked how long meetings lasted when neighboring landowners visited. He noticed which evenings ended in laughter and which ended in shouting. Because behind that door was not a dungeon, it was an office, a room where ledgers were kept, crop yields, punishment logs, purchase records, names, always the names. On plantations like this, control was not chaos, it was accounting. Every body reduced to ink, every back measured in output, every whisper evaluated against profit. And Elijah had figured something out. He had learned to read. Not fluently, not publicly, but enough. Years earlier, the master's youngest son had grown bored during arithmetic lessons. He had thrown chalk at Elijah, mocking him, ordering him to hold the slate while he practiced numbers aloud. Children underestimate who is listening. By accident, or perhaps by quiet design, Elijah absorbed the symbols. He learned what columns meant. He learned what subtraction looked like. And once a man understands numbers, he understands leverage. From outside the door, Elijah could hear pages turning. He could hear when the master hesitated, when the scratching of pen slowed over a particular name. Sometimes, very softly, he would press his ear to the wood. And what he discovered over time was this: the master was afraid. Afraid of rebellion upriver, afraid of rumors spreading from other plantations, afraid of losing control. The ledger was not just a record of ownership, it was a map of anxiety. And Elijah was learning how to read it without ever stepping inside. Because sometimes the most dangerous position is not at the center of power, it is just outside it, where no one thinks to look. What no one else realized was that Elijah wasn't listening to serve the master, he was studying him. And once you understand a man's fears, you hold something far stronger than chains.
Fear has a sound. It is not loud. It does not shout or slam doors. It hesitates. Elijah began to recognize it in the pauses between pen strokes, in the way the master's chair creaked when certain names were spoken aloud during private meetings, in the subtle tightening of silence when the word uprising drifted through the floorboards like smoke. By autumn, he knew more about the master's anxieties than the overseer did, and that was dangerous, because power assumes it is the observer, never the observed. One night, as rain pressed softly against the plantation roof, Elijah noticed something new. The master was not alone behind the door. Another voice, deeper, older, carried through the wood. A neighboring plantation owner, judging by the tone. They were not discussing crops. They were discussing loyalty. Specifically, how to fracture it. Grant one small privilege, not freedom, just movement. Let the others see it. They will turn on each other before they turn on you. Elijah did not move. The rain grew heavier. Divide them, the master replied. Yes, that would work. There it was, confirmation. The night walks were not kindness. They were strategy. Elijah had been selected not because he was trusted, but because he was useful. A symbol, a wedge, a living experiment in psychological division. And the others had felt it. The sideways glances, the whispers, the slow erosion of unity. This was not about the door. It was about isolation. Make one man appear favored, and the group polices itself. Make hope look individualized, and solidarity dissolves. Elijah understood now. He was a variable in an equation, but equations can be rewritten. Over the next few weeks, something subtle shifted in the quarters. Elijah began returning earlier from the fields. He started speaking again, softly, carefully, not defending himself, not explaining the night walks, but asking questions. What did you hear today? Who was called to the house? Which crates were loaded onto the riverboat? Information flowed where suspicion once lived. He never mentioned the door, never mentioned the ledger, but he began mapping something larger than the master's fears. He was mapping the plantation's vulnerabilities. Supply routes, guard rotations, harvest schedules, and most importantly, the master's financial strain. Because hidden within those hesitant pen strokes was a truth. The plantation was not thriving, it was surviving. And a desperate man with authority is far more reckless than a secure one. One evening, as Elijah stood once more by the oak door, he heard something that changed the rhythm entirely. The master spoke a single sentence that did not belong in a ledger. If we lose even 3 more, we are finished. Elijah's breath slowed. 3 more what? Workers? Shipments? Or secrets? Whatever it was, the foundation beneath the house had begun to crack, and Elijah was the only one who could hear it.
The sentence echoed in Elijah's mind long after the lantern flame had burned low. If we lose even 3 more, we are finished. Finished. Men like the master did not use that word lightly, not in business, not in private, not unless the ground beneath them was already unstable. For the first time, Elijah understood something critical. The plantation was not an empire, it was a balancing act. Cotton prices had dipped along the river, transport costs had risen. There were rumors, quiet, dangerous rumors of increased patrols upriver after a failed revolt. Investors were nervous, credit was tightening, and credit was oxygen. Without it, plantations suffocated. The ledger inside that room was no longer just a record of labor, it was a countdown. Over the next few nights, Elijah listened more carefully than ever before. He heard the master calculating losses. He heard frustration when shipments didn't meet projected weights. He heard the unmistakable strain in a man who realized his authority might soon outpace his resources. Control requires money. Money requires output. Output requires obedience. And obedience, when fragile, is expensive. The night walks suddenly made perfect sense. The master was not rewarding Elijah, he was experimenting with morale control. Reduce punishments slightly, allow one man visible mobility, decrease random searches, create the illusion of softened authority to prevent rebellion during financial instability. It was not mercy, it was cost management.
Elijah almost admired the precision of it. Almost. But here is where the master made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed Elijah could hear only what was spoken. He never considered what could be inferred. If losing 3 more meant collapse, then the plantation's margin was razor thin. 3 disruptions, 3 disappearances, 3 failures. That was all it would take. Not rebellion, not fire, just imbalance. Elijah did not plan revolt. He planned mathematics. The following week, 2 workers fell ill, genuinely ill, from contaminated water near the lower marsh. They could not work for several days. Production dipped slightly. The master's voice behind the door grew sharper. "That makes 2, he muttered one evening. 2. Elijah's pulse steadied. He did nothing. He encouraged nothing. He simply observed. Because when a system is stretched to its limit, the smallest variables become catastrophic. Then came the 3rd, a shipment delayed by flooding along the river, not sabotage, not resistance, weather. But to the ledger it counted. 3 losses. And that night, behind the oak door, Elijah heard something he had never heard before. Not anger, not calculation. Fear without disguise. A chair overturned, a glass shattered, and a whispered sentence that revealed everything. We are exposed. Exposed. Not weak, not struggling. Exposed. Which meant there was something hidden far larger than debt. And for the first time, Elijah realized the door was not protecting the workers from what was inside. It was protecting the master from what might get out.
The night the glass shattered, the plantation did not sleep. Fear travels faster than fire. Even from the quarters they heard the crash, the raised voice, the hurried footsteps crossing the floorboards above the rear foundation. Something had ruptured, not physically, but structurally. Elijah did not move toward the house that evening. For the first time in months, he remained in the shadows near the tree line, watching. Because when power panics, it makes mistakes, and mistakes reveal architecture. The next morning, everything changed. The overseer resumed random inspections. Searches returned. 2 men were whipped publicly for minor infractions that would have been ignored weeks earlier. The illusion of softened control was over, which meant the experiment had failed. But failed how? Elijah replayed the master's words in his mind. We are exposed. Exposed to whom? Creditors? Neighboring landowners? Authorities? Or something even more dangerous? Evidence? That afternoon, while carrying sacks toward the storage shed, Elijah noticed something subtle but critical. The master's youngest son was loading crates into a wagon personally. That never happened. The son avoided labor. Yet now he worked urgently, sealing wooden boxes with shaking hands. Boxes marked not with crop insignias, but with initials and dates. Elijah's breath slowed. Documents. Not cotton, not tools. Paper. Paper is power. Paper is proof. And proof can destroy reputations faster than rebellion ever could. That night, Elijah returned to the oak door. But something was different. The usual scratch of pen on parchment was absent. Instead, he heard the tearing of pages. Ripping, methodical, controlled. The master was destroying records, not crop yields, not punishment logs. Specific pages, specific names. Elijah pressed his ear closer. A phrase slipped through the wood like poison. If they audit, we're ruined. Audit. That was not a word spoken among planters casually. That meant scrutiny from above,
from investors, from regional authorities, from men who valued numbers over pride. And if numbers didn't align, ownership could shift, land could be seized, accounts could be frozen. Elijah finally understood the deeper truth. The plantation wasn't collapsing because of 3 missed outputs. It was collapsing because the ledger lied. For years, the master had inflated production numbers to secure credit, overstated yields, underreported losses, used bodies as collateral in a financial game built on deception. And now, someone, somewhere, had begun asking questions. The night walks, the reduced punishments, the illusion of stability. It was all designed to prevent unrest while the master quietly corrected the books. But he waited too long. The pressure was here, and pressure always finds a fracture. Elijah stepped back from the door slowly. The power dynamic had shifted. For the first time, the master was not the only man on the plantation guarding a secret. Because Elijah now understood something devastating. The system controlling them was not just cruel, it was fragile. And fragile systems, once cracked, do not recover quietly. They shatter.
When a man realizes the system above him is fragile, something changes inside him. Not hope, not yet, but calculation. Elijah understood now that rebellion was unnecessary. The plantation was already destabilizing itself. The master's lies had created a pressure chamber, and the audit, whatever form it took, would be the spark. But sparks need oxygen, and Elijah knew exactly where to let air in. 2 days after the ripping of pages, riders arrived from upriver. Not soldiers, not militia. Accountants. You could tell by the way they dismounted, careful, observant, measuring the land with their eyes rather than their weapons. Their coats were cleaner than any overseer's. Their boots carried city dust instead of field mud. They were not here for discipline. They were here for numbers. The master greeted them with a smile stretched too tight. The overseer stood straighter than usual. The workers were ordered to continue as normal, but nothing was normal. From the fields, Elijah watched the men disappear into the house, into the room behind the oak door. That door, once a symbol of untouchable authority, was now a liability, because whatever remained inside that office would be examined line by line, and Elijah knew pages were missing. You must understand something crucial. Audits are not just about numbers, they are about patterns. Missing entries draw more suspicion than bad ones. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Elijah made a decision that would alter everything. He did not approach the door, he approached the well. Near the well sat an older worker named Samuel, a man invisible to most because he spoke little and limped from an old injury. But Samuel had once worked in the main house decades earlier. He had seen ledgers before. "Elijah," Samuel murmured without looking up, "they're counting." "Yes," Elijah replied softly, "and they'll notice what's gone." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You think they don't already know?" That was the moment, the realization. What if the audit wasn't random? What if the investors had suspected for months? What if the master's panic wasn't about discovery, but confirmation? That night, Elijah did something he had never done before. He did not listen at the door. He circled the house. Windows glowed faintly along the eastern wall. Through one, barely visible between curtains, he saw the edge of a desk, stacks of paper, and one open ledger, untorn, unburned, hidden from the shredding. The real numbers. The master had destroyed copies, but he kept the truth, because even liars need accurate records. Elijah stepped back into shadow. The entire structure of power rested on paper inside that room, and paper can be moved, paper can be revealed, paper can travel farther than whispers ever could. The plantation believed chains held it together, but chains were not the binding force. Debt was. And if the truth of that debt escaped those walls, the master would not just lose authority, he would lose ownership. For the first time, Elijah understood. The door was no longer a boundary. It was an opportunity.
Night draped itself over the plantation like a velvet shroud, suffocating, absolute. Every sound became exaggerated, the creak of a branch, the distant call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through the cotton. But Elijah felt no fear. Fear, he realized, had already been expended by the master's tyranny. What remained was a sharper instinct, patience, observation, precision. He knew that every step he took outside the quarters was being recorded, mentally catalogued by the eyes of those who believed themselves invincible. The overseer's shadow, long and rigid, stretched across the yard. The dogs had been fed, their chains short, their barks clipped by the proximity of the house. Every measure was designed to enforce the illusion of control. And yet, control is fragile, Elijah thought. Like glass pressed under too much weight, it will crack, and when it does, the shards cut everyone indiscriminately. He moved to the back of the house, careful to remain where the moonlight barely reached. The alcove where the door waited, ominous, silent, impenetrable, was now more than a symbol. It was a gauge of human obedience. The night revealed what the day could not. The anxiety, the discipline, the fear meticulously cultivated over years. And yet, Elijah also saw cracks, small acts of defiance hidden in plain sight, a basket placed incorrectly, a footstep held a second too long, subtle, almost imperceptible, but significant. He crouched behind a bush and watched as two men emerged from the house carrying a covered trunk. They were silent, deliberate, their eyes never meeting the open darkness. Elijah recognized the ritual, secrecy, repetition, ritualized obedience. These were not mistakes. These were rehearsed acts designed to erase questions before they could exist. But Elijah had questions, and questions, once cultivated, cannot be contained. From the shadows, he memorized their route, the subtle signals they used, the timing of each movement. Each detail would matter later. The night itself seemed complicit, holding its breath as if aware that its silence was a witness to something forbidden. Elijah understood now. The door was only a symbol to most, but to him it had become a key not to the room, but to the empire of secrets and lies built on the labor and bodies of men. By the time the last echo of boots faded into the distance, Elijah had already begun to plan. A path forward required more than courage. It required understanding the mechanics of fear, the economy of secrecy, the human compulsion to obey. This was no longer about curiosity or rebellion. It was about dismantling a system from within, using its own obsessions against it. And in that still, humid night, beneath the vast canopy of Mississippi stars, he whispered to himself, "Every empire has a weakness, even this one." If you're ready to go deeper, comment "Shadow Unlocked" twice below. This isn't just for the algorithm, it's a ritual, a symbol that you are stepping into truths that were never meant for ordinary eyes.
The next day dawned heavy and oppressive, the Mississippi sun beating down on Harrow Hill as though it too were complicit in maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Fields stretched like waves of white, bending slightly in the breeze, but beneath their apparent tranquility, the plantation throbbed with tension. Elijah moved with calculated patience, blending seamlessly into the daily rhythm. He laughed with the others, carried sacks, hauled water, performed tasks with a fluid, practiced invisibility. His movements were invisible threads woven into the tapestry of control, unnoticed yet meticulously observed. Every glance he stole at the house, every slight deviation from the assigned path was measured, filed, and analyzed in the quiet of his mind. He had discovered patterns, when certain doors opened, when Lyle's shadow lengthened across the yard, when Nora's hands trembled just enough to betray her attention. These were breadcrumbs, pieces of a puzzle that would reveal the machinery behind the facade of obedience. He began cataloging not just actions, but reactions, a slip of a gaze, a subtle stiffening of a shoulder. Every moment of fear became data. By midday, he had found his first opportunity. A delivery of provisions from town required the men to open a side gate that led past the alcove of the locked door. Lyle lingered nearby, but his attention was momentarily split between two arriving wagons. Elijah's heart pounded, not with fear, but with exhilaration of imminent insight. He moved quietly, deliberately, taking the exact path Ruth had avoided for decades. The door loomed ahead, its blackened oak and tarnished iron bands radiating a presence that made his pulse quicken. He reached for the doorknob, but stopped. Not yet. Patience was key. He observed a subtle exchange between a visitor and Lyle, a nod, a key produced from a hidden pocket, a shadow slipping through the door. For the first time, Elijah saw it fully. The door was not merely a symbol of secrecy. It was a controlled point of access, a gate through which the plantation's unseen transactions passed. The living, breathing enforcement of silence was no longer abstract. It had a heartbeat, and tonight he would follow it. Every moment he delayed only sharpened his focus. He memorized the placement of the key, the precise timing of each lock and unlatch. He noticed the scent of the air, a mixture of damp earth, smoke from the kitchen hearth, and something metallic, almost antiseptic. It clung to the doorway like a warning. And yet the danger only drew him closer. Danger, Elijah understood, is the ultimate truth revealer. By nightfall, he had constructed a mental map of the door's operation. He understood now that the door was a tool not of simple confinement, but of systemic erasure. And he knew, if he were patient, meticulous, and observant, he could witness what no one had dared to see for decades. The plantation slept, oblivious to the schemes unfolding in plain sight. Elijah whispered under his breath, "Tonight, the hidden becomes visible."
Night fell like a velvet shroud over Harrow Hill, thick and suffocating, the humid air pressing down on every inch of the plantation. The cicadas droned a relentless, hypnotic chant, masking the subtle movements within the estate. Elijah waited in the shadows, each breath measured, each heartbeat synchronized with the faint rustle of leaves. The yard seemed empty, but he knew better. The silence itself was orchestrated. It was the sound of obedience, the sound of fear, the sound of lives constrained within invisible chains. He moved like a wraith, limbs taut with anticipation, eyes fixed on the alcove where the locked door sat. Moonlight barely touched its surface, leaving it almost entirely in shadow, a black monolith against the faint shimmer of jasmine and kudzu. Elijah had learned the timing, the cues, the subtle shift of Lyle's stance, the brief flicker of Nora's lantern through a high window, the distant squeal of a horse, each a note in a symphony of hidden control. Tonight, he would witness the truth. A carriage rolled quietly over the earth, its wheels muffled by the soft ground, horses moving with careful precision. Lyle emerged, key in hand, followed by a figure Elijah had not seen before. Smaller, hunched, careful. The figure's face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, features obscured by shadow. Lyle whispered something inaudible to Elijah, then produced the heavy key and unlocked the door. The click resonated like a gunshot in the night, a violent punctuation in the silence. Elijah's pulse surged as he watched the door swing inward. The darkness beyond seemed to breathe, swallowing the two figures like a living entity. He could hear the faint scrape of boots, the soft thud of a satchel being set down, the barely perceptible whisper of breath. Then, movement. A slight form, barely human in its stillness, was guided into the room, led by hands both firm and efficient. It was not an act of care, nor cruelty. It was procedure, mechanized, cold, perfectly practiced. The door closed behind them with a final resounding click. Lyle lingered, scanning the yard, ensuring no unseen eyes bore witness, then retreated into the shadows. Elijah remained motionless, sweat prickling his skin, mind racing. The sound of the locked door was now a signal, a heartbeat marking the invisible passage of lives from one reality to another. He realized with a sinking certainty that Harrow Hill's power did not rely on fear alone. It relied on erasure, on removing not just bodies, but the memory of them. Each locked door, each hushed whisper, each disappearance was a calculated step in a system designed to make people vanish without a trace. The machinery of silence was more terrifying than any lash, any shout, any overt display of authority. And as Elijah retreated into the shadows, heart pounding, he whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning."
The next day, the sun rose over Harrow Hill as if nothing had happened, painting the cotton fields in hues of white and gold, hiding the dark mechanics beneath. Elijah moved among the workers with quiet vigilance, observing, cataloging, remembering. Every face held stories, some whispered in fleeting glances, some etched into the lines of worn skin. He knew that many of them carried secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The plantation was alive with them, but its heartbeat was silence. He focused on the missing, those who had vanished without explanation. Cyrus, the strong horseman whose pride had drawn the master's attention. Della, the gentle girl with the carved wooden bird. Others, too, nameless to the records, erased as though they had never existed. Elijah began drawing mental maps, linking disappearances to patterns in the house, the timing of Dr. Speck's visits, and the positions Lyle had taken when observing the yard. Each detail seemed trivial alone, but together they formed a lattice of fear and methodical control. He returned to Ruth that evening, under the guise of helping with chores. She acknowledged him with the faintest nod, her eyes wary, heavy with centuries of unspoken knowledge. "You saw it," she said quietly, almost a whisper carried in the dark. Her words were both accusation and confirmation. Elijah met her gaze steadily, letting silence speak for him. Ruth had seen the machinery of erasure from the inside. She knew who had been taken, who had been traded, and how the system maintained itself with quiet precision. "I need to understand," Elijah said softly, careful not to alarm her. Ruth's hand stilled on the laundry basket, fingers tightening. She leaned closer, her voice dropping lower. "You think it's about death, but it ain't. It's control. Each life that disappears, it's a message that no one, not even the strongest, the cleverest, can escape the eyes that watch every move." The air around them seemed to thicken, heavy with humidity and dread. Elijah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. This was no ordinary cruelty. This was institutionalized erasure, sanctioned not by chaos, but by design. Every movement, every transaction, every subtle nod between Elias Vane, Lyle, and Dr. Speck was a stitch in a fabric meant to erase humanity without leaving a trace.
"And the door?" Elijah asked, voice barely audible. Ruth looked toward the rear of the house, her gaze lingering in the shadowed alcove where the black oak door waited, eternal and unyielding. "It keeps the past in its place," she said. "It keeps the watchers safe. It keeps the world believing nothing untoward happens here, but what happens inside, it changes everything." Elijah's mind raced, absorbing the scale of the horror. The locked door was not a secret. It was an instrument, a tool that separated reality from perception, life from erasure. And he, for the first time, truly understood the price of curiosity. The knowledge he now held was dangerous, heavier than any chain, sharper than any blade.
Night fell like a suffocating blanket over Harrow Hill, the cicadas' chorus swelling in the humid darkness. Elijah lay awake on his thin pallet, mind spinning with the fragments Ruth had shared. The door, the disappearances, the silent complicity of everyone around him, it all formed a pattern, precise and horrifying. He realized the erasure was not a byproduct of cruelty, but a calculated, repeated system. Each missing worker, each falsified death was an element in a machine designed to maintain absolute control. He slipped from the quarters, moving silently across the uneven ground, every footfall measured. The moon was a thin, pale crescent, offering just enough light to navigate without drawing attention. He had learned the rhythms of the plantation, the bell's call, the overseer's patrols, the subtle shifts in Lyle's stance, and he used them now as a map to avoid detection. Tonight he would see the door again, closer this time, perhaps glimpse the hidden mechanism of this silent horror. As he approached the rear of the house, the shadows seemed thicker, almost sentient, as if the air itself wanted to warn him away. And there it was, the black oak door, unyielding, ancient, untouched by time, but heavy with intent. The humidity hung in waves, curling around his sweat-dampened skin. He crouched in the overgrown jasmine, observing. The plantation was asleep, or pretending to be, but he sensed eyes watching, invisible, methodical. Moments later, a carriage rolled quietly down the seldom-used track. Elijah recognized the silhouettes immediately, Lyle and Dr. Speck, moving with silent precision toward the locked door. Lyle produced the heavy key, the metallic click ringing faintly in the night, followed by the resonant groan of hinges. Elijah's breath caught. He had never heard anything so final. They disappeared inside, swallowed by the darkness beyond the door. The world outside remained still, serene, completely unaware. Elijah's heart pounded. He could not see what happened inside, but the air shifted, thick with an almost tangible weight. He strained to catch sounds, the faintest clink of metal, a soft, deliberate sigh, the rhythm of a process unfolding in secrecy. It was work, precise and unhurried, yet there was an underlying horror in its efficiency. Human lives were being manipulated, processed, and erased, not violently, but with surgical method. He pressed closer to the wall, a thin line of moonlight illuminating his sweat-streaked face. This was the truth of Harrow Hill, the truth that no overseer, no worker, no neighbor dared acknowledge. The door was not merely wood and iron. It was the fulcrum of a system that traded existence for compliance, that converted human beings into invisible commodities. It was not just secrecy, it was power incarnate. Elijah realized then the danger he bore simply by seeing, by understanding. Knowledge here was a weapon, one that could destroy him as easily as it had erased Cyrus and Dela. Yet the fire of curiosity, the hunger for truth, burned brighter than fear.
and he knew that tonight he had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back. The first hints of dawn glimmered over Harrow Hill, painting the sky in pale, hesitant streaks of orange and lavender. Elijah remained hidden in the shadows, yet his mind raced faster than the coming sun. What he had witnessed in the dead of night was more than a mystery. It was a deliberate architecture of erasure, a hidden system of control that extended far beyond the reach of the locked door. Every absence, every disappearance was carefully orchestrated, tracked, and accounted for. He thought of Cyrus, strong and proud, gone without a trace; of Della, sweet, singing Della, dissolved into an unrecorded void. And then he remembered Ruth's quiet words, "It ain't for keepin' things out, it's for keepin' things in." The implication hit him like a hammer. The locked door was the pivot point of a human factory, a machine that converted lives into commodities, stripping identity and memory with ruthless precision. It wasn't death they were manufacturing, it was submission, control, silence. Elijah's thoughts turned to Nora Vane, trapped within her gilded prison of silk and social expectation. Her awakening would come slowly, as it always did for those complicit in the system. But in him there was no patience for delayed awareness. He understood that the key to unmasking the truth lay not only in observation, but in mapping the psychological machinery that governed every corner of Harrow Hill. He began to remember subtle patterns he had noticed since his arrival. The overseer's almost imperceptible shifts in posture, the unspoken avoidance of certain areas, the way workers instinctively rerouted their paths to never confront the door. It was a choreography of fear, internalized and unquestioned. Fear had been encoded into behavior, turning every laborer, every servant, into an unwitting participant in the maintenance of secrecy. The plantation itself had become a living organism, feeding on silence, thriving on the unasked questions, the unseen threats. Elijah's pulse quickened as he realized that the system went deeper than human complicity. There was a bureaucracy at work, hidden yet systematic. The falsified medical records, the shipments, the new identities, all part of an intricate mechanism designed to erase existence and replace it with illusion. The dead were never dead. They were shuffled, repurposed, and rendered invisible to all but the master, his trusted agents, and the clandestine network of obedience surrounding the door. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon him like a physical force. Every step he had taken, every observation, every cautious note was part of a path toward a truth that could shatter the very fabric of the plantation's hierarchy. Yet the deeper he descended into this reality, the more he felt alive, more acutely aware of the human capacity for control, manipulation, and the terrifying efficiency of systemic cruelty. As the first bird calls pierced the heavy Mississippi air, Elijah knew he was no longer merely a spectator. He had become a witness, a keeper of knowledge too dangerous to share freely, yet too vital to ignore. And in that silent acknowledgement, he accepted the peril that came with seeing too clearly. He had glimpsed the machinery behind the masked civility of Harrow Hill, and now he had to understand it fully. Elijah's mind traced the web of control that extended far beyond the walls of the main house. Every action, every absence, every carefully avoided glance had a purpose. The locked door was merely the visible apex of a much larger system, a hierarchy of fear, manipulation, and calculated obedience. Harrow Hill itself was a machine, a silent predator disguised as a home. Its pulse was the plantation bell, its lifeblood the laboring hands of those who did not dare question, and its central command the locked door. He began to catalog the mechanics of this control. First, the absence of information. Workers were never told, never explained. A missing person became a rumor, a quiet nothing that dissolved into daily life. It was not the whip that maintained obedience, it was ambiguity, uncertainty, and the fear of erasure. The mind filled the gaps with dread far more potent than any physical punishment. Fear, when internalized, became invisible chains, wrapping around every thought and movement, shaping behavior without ever touching flesh. Second, the presence of surveillance. The overseers moved with subtle, almost imperceptible cues. Augustus Lyle's gaze swept corridors like a predator circling its territory. The eyes of Nora and the domestic staff, weary yet precise, absorbed every gesture, every deviation from protocol. Even the very architecture of the house funneled attention and constrained movement. There were corridors without windows, rooms that served as observation points, alcoves for silent judgment. Every shadow, every threshold had been designed to reinforce obedience, to make deviation psychologically uncomfortable. Third, the manufactured reality of death and disappearance. The falsified records, the staged illnesses, the shipments to unknown destinations, all served to condition compliance. Life itself became transactional, disposable, replaceable. The mind could be broken, reshaped, or erased entirely through repetition of ritual and unchallenged silence. No one dared to speak of the missing, and those who glimpsed too much vanished. The locked door was both symbol and instrument, the ultimate enforcer of unspoken law. Elijah felt the weight of comprehension pressing down on him. Understanding was not freedom, it was responsibility, and it was dangerous. Every observation carried risk. Every thought of rebellion could ignite consequences, invisible but absolute. He recognized the artistry behind the terror, a calculated, almost surgical orchestration of control that ensured that no one could challenge the system because no one could even fully perceive it. And yet, in this descent into understanding, Elijah felt a spark, an awakening. For those who saw clearly, the system's logic revealed its weaknesses. Subtle inconsistencies, small cracks in ritualized obedience, human errors in the choreography of fear. To witness this was to gain power, but it was a power laced with peril. The closer one came to the truth, the more dangerous the knowledge became. By the time the sun crested the horizon, painting Harrow Hill in the deceptive glow of normalcy, Elijah had resolved that he would go deeper. Not as a worker, not as a servant, not even as a witness, but as an observer, who might one day understand the full extent of the machinery that bound the plantation. And as he stepped into the morning heat, he carried with him a certainty. The locked door was not the end, it was only the beginning.
The days blurred into one another, but Elijah's attention never wavered. Every gesture, every pause, every unspoken rule on Harrow Hill was now etched into his memory. He realized that the door's power was not in its wood or iron. It was in the fear it cultivated, the discipline it imposed without a single lash. It shaped minds before it ever touched bodies. And it demanded obedience not through law or threat, but through a system so subtle that the enslaved accepted it as natural, as inevitable. Elijah began to notice patterns, the slight hesitation of a worker's step near the rear alcove, the barely perceptible tightening of an overseer's jaw, the careful avoidance of the door in the routines of even the youngest children on the estate. Each movement reinforced the invisible hierarchy of control. Every glance that avoided the door was a lesson in submission. Every whispered warning, every story of disappearance was a thread in a vast, intricate web designed to trap thought itself. That night, while the moon carved silver paths across the cotton fields, Elijah approached Ruth. He had learned patience. True observation required it.
Her eyes, still clouded with the ancient sorrow of Harrow Hill, held a universe of unspoken truths. He spoke softly, almost as if testing the air. "Ruth, the door. What else must I understand?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze wandered to the shadowed alcove, lingering on the locked oak as though it held her memories hostage. "You see it now, don't you, boy? Not as wood, not as iron. You see the quiet, the absence, the way it makes a body forget it has curiosity, how it whispers that asking is dangerous, that thinking is dangerous." Her voice carried a weight that sank into his chest. He nodded, silent, aware that this was a threshold. Understanding the mechanics of fear was not enough. One had to navigate them, survive them, and perhaps one day use them. Ruth's next words were deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Speak the words, Elijah. Speak them twice, and let them anchor you to what you now see. Say, 'I see the hidden. I walk among the unseen.' Say it again." He did as she instructed, the repetition feeling like a pulse, a rhythmic confirmation of his new awareness. The phrase vibrated in the air, binding his perception to the truths Ruth could not fully articulate. This was no idle exercise. It was a subtle initiation, a symbolic act that aligned him with the hidden currents of power and fear that ruled Harrow Hill. As the final syllables left his lips, Elijah felt something shift within him. Fear did not leave, but it transformed. It became a tool, a lens. He understood that knowledge here was dangerous, seductive, and intoxicating. Each secret held the power to destroy or empower, and the door was the epicenter of that power. To glimpse it, to understand even a fraction of its significance, was to step into a world where human lives were commodities and obedience was currency. Outside, the night breathed in deep, humid waves, and the shadows stretched long over the fields. Elijah turned back towards the quarters, each step deliberate, each breath a measure of resolve. He was no longer merely a witness. He was now a participant in the silent war between ignorance and awareness, between compliance and understanding. The door waited, and so did the truth.
The next morning, Elijah woke before the sun, his body stiff but his mind sharp. He had slept little, the words Ruth had forced him to speak still echoing in his head like a chant, a tether to this hidden world he had entered. Today, he would begin the work of mapping. Not the fields, not the tools, not even the routines of the overseers. No, he would map the disappearances. He would trace the pattern of absence, the rhythm of those who had been claimed by that locked door, the invisible hand of Elias Vane's meticulous system. He started with the quarters, noting names, ages, tasks, and peculiarities. Who vanished first, who lasted longer, who skirted too close to the door without consequences. Each small observation added another line to the mental ledger he carried. The disappearances were never random. They were surgical. Each erasure served a purpose, a warning to others, a reinforcement of obedience, a removal of potential curiosity before it became dangerous. Elijah realized that the fear surrounding the door was as much about conditioning the survivors as it was about punishing the victims. He spoke cautiously with Ruth, coaxing details from her while respecting the boundaries of her trauma. "Cyrus, Della, the others," he asked quietly, "were they taken because they saw too much, or because they might have asked questions?" Ruth's eyes flickered toward the rear alcove again, and her hand stilled mid-task. "Not just seen, boy," she said, her voice a low tremor. "They were considered liabilities. Every mind that wondered, every spirit that questioned, had to be managed. The door, it was the tool for that. You don't think it's wood and iron. It's a system,
a mechanism of control that uses absence itself as punishment. Elijah felt the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. Absence as punishment, the most insidious form of terror, not the lash, not the public humiliation, but the erasure of being itself. People weren't just silenced, they were removed from reality, reduced to whispers, rumors, and vanished names. He thought of the shipment notes, the false death records, the doctor's clandestine visits, the quiet efficiency with which lives were folded into the machinery of Harrow Hill. Every detail confirmed it. This was a calculated, systematic eradication of identity, sanctioned and refined over decades. By mid-afternoon, Elijah had begun a sketch in his mind, a lattice of connections between the workers, the overseers, the supposed deaths, the movements of the doctor. He saw patterns in the timing. Certain disappearances coincided with new arrivals, with the introduction of new crops, with social events in Natchez. Each event was a pressure point, a manipulation of human behavior to maintain the illusion of order. The door was only the most visible symbol, the anchor for a far more complex network of psychological control. As the sun dipped behind the distant cypress trees, Elijah felt a strange clarity. The world of Harrow Hill was no longer a static backdrop. It was a dynamic system of power and suppression, and he was learning its rules. Every shadow hid a lesson. Every silence spoke volumes. And in the center of it all, the locked door waited, indifferent, absolute, the ultimate testament to the invisible architecture of fear.
That night, Elijah lay awake, the humid Mississippi air pressing against his skin like a living weight. But sleep was impossible. The locked door had awakened something in him, a pulse of curiosity mingled with dread. He knew the patterns Ruth hinted at were not accidents, they were meticulously engineered. Every disappearance, every erased life had been orchestrated with surgical precision. He resolved to uncover the logic, to map the system that turned people into ghosts, that weaponized absence itself. He began with the perimeter of the main house, moving silently through the shadows. Every detail mattered, the positioning of windows, the angles of staircases, the subtle wear in the stone steps where few dared tread. He noticed small discrepancies, footprints that led nowhere, pathways overgrown and unused, and an almost imperceptible residue of activity around the rear alcove. The earth there seemed to hold memories, impressions of movement that no one dared acknowledge. The door was only the final instrument, the focus point, but the influence radiated outward, shaping behavior, silencing minds. Elijah's observations extended to the people themselves. Augustus Lyle, the overseer, was no ordinary enforcer. His loyalty to Elias Vane was absolute, but it was more than obedience, it was indoctrination. Every movement, every glance, every measured breath around the rear alcove was rehearsed, ritualized, as though Lyle himself had been molded by the door's invisible power. And the doctor, Speck, was complicit in the same machinery. His role in legitimizing disappearances through false medical reports ensured the illusion of natural order remained intact. The system did not need overt cruelty. It needed the veneer of legality, the suffocating weight of silence. Elijah began noting the sequence of disappearances, who vanished first, who lasted longest, and the indirect triggers that preceded each. Some were removed after minor missteps, approaching the door too closely, asking subtle questions, showing too much intelligence. Others were eliminated quietly, their erasure masked by illness, sudden accidents, or the logistics of relocation. Each removal reinforced obedience among the survivors, teaching them through absence that curiosity could be fatal. The pattern was terrifyingly deliberate, almost algorithmic, a dark calculus of power.
By the third night, Elijah's mind had sharpened. He could anticipate the movements of those around the rear alcove, the responses of overseers and domestic staff, even the timing of the doctor's clandestine visits. He realized that the door was more than wood and iron. It was the fulcrum of a psychological mechanism, a centralized node of fear, control, and invisibility. It converted uncertainty into compliance, absence into absolute authority. And then, in a flash of realization, he understood the final, horrifying truth. The system was not merely to hide deaths, it was to manufacture them, to erase existence itself. Every disappearance, every false record, every silent, fearful glance around the door was a thread in a web designed to manipulate reality itself. The door did not just guard the past, it dictated the present and shaped the future of every living being on Harrow Hill.
The next day, Elijah moved through the quarters like a shadow, unseen yet observing everything. Each step he took was deliberate. He had learned the rhythm of Harrow Hill, and he used it to his advantage. He watched the workers, noting their subtle habits, how they avoided the rear alcove, how their eyes flicked toward it and immediately looked away, how their voices softened whenever the topic of the main house drifted near. Fear was encoded into their very movements, a genetic memory of the unspoken punishments exacted by that door. He began mapping the disappearances in his mind, pairing each with minor events that preceded them. A worker asking an offhand question, a glance too long in curiosity, a delay in completing a chore. Each anomaly, each small rebellion had been met with a precise, invisible hand. It was not punishment through violence, but through absence, a concept so insidious that it became impossible to argue against. The living learned from the dead or the missing. Fear was inherited, codified, and ritualized. Elijah turned his attention to Dr. Speck. The man's visits were always quiet, always methodical. Elijah noticed patterns in the doctor's timing, moon phases, tidal schedules of the nearby tributary, even the subtle positions of the sun at different times of year. Nothing about the operation was random. Every visit, every document, every measurement was calibrated to maintain the illusion of normalcy. And yet, through it all, there was a deliberate acceleration of life's end for select individuals. The machinery of erasure was precise, almost surgical. Then came the first anomaly Elijah had not expected. In the back of the kitchen, he found a faint mark, a scratch in the wood near the alcove, too deliberate to be natural. It wasn't on the floorboards, he could tell from the angle, but on the wall itself, hidden behind layers of dust and grime. It was a symbol, a tiny code left by someone who had survived or someone who had been returned. The mark spoke of caution, of warning, of paths unseen. Elijah traced the lines with his fingertip, feeling the weight of centuries of fear and survival encoded in a single, barely perceptible message. It was then that he realized the full horror of the system. This was not just about control. It was about information, about who knew what and when. Every disappearance, every false death, every silenced worker was part of an algorithm of secrecy. Knowledge itself was weaponized. Elijah understood that the door did not merely hide the missing, it protected the process, encrypted the truth, and ensured the plantation's power remained unchallenged. For the first time, he felt the pulse of dread not only from the door, but from the invisible machinery it represented. He was no longer just observing, he was learning. And in learning, he knew he had crossed a threshold, one that could not be uncrossed. To see the system was to inherit its burden, to feel the weight of the lives erased, and to understand that even the smallest misstep could make him the next ghost. That night, Elijah did not sleep. The room was hot, the air thick with the lingering smell of sweat and decay. But it was the silence that pressed most heavily against him.
Outside, cicadas droned endlessly, and the distant tributary whispered secrets he dared not interpret. He paced the narrow confines of the cabin, thinking about Ruth's words, about the scratched symbols, about the door itself. Every detail now seemed like a breadcrumb laid out for someone daring enough to see beyond the plantation's polished facade. He began retracing the paths of those who had disappeared. Cyrus, Dela, others whose names had been murmured in half-forgotten conversation. There were patterns, not obvious, not numerical, but spatial, psychological. Their absences were orchestrated, each removal calculated to maintain maximum fear and minimum inquiry. Even the natural rhythms of the plantation, the meals, the labor, the bell, served as camouflage, a predictable cadence that lulled the living into obedience. Elijah understood the genius and cruelty of it. The missing were invisible, but their absence was weaponized, teaching the survivors the limits of curiosity without a single lash. He noticed subtle traces, shifts in dust patterns near the alcove, slight inconsistencies in how the baskets were stacked, faint smells that did not belong to food or wood or human sweat. There were the whispers of those who had been taken, the residue of a presence erased but not entirely extinguished. It was as if the door itself exhaled a trace, a signature, a warning meant for those who could read between the lines. Elijah began documenting everything in his mind, forming a map of secrecy layered over the known plantation. Each observation strengthened a terrifying hypothesis. The door was not merely a container of people. It was a node of power, a tool of information control, and a mechanism for enforcing absolute obedience. By controlling what was seen and what was not, Elias Vane had created an ecosystem of terror that extended far beyond the visible. Knowledge, even accidental knowledge, was dangerous. Ignorance was survival. He replayed the night he saw Dr. Speck and Lyle enter the door. The rhythmic, mechanical sounds, the absence of screams, the controlled silence, they now took on a new significance. This was a procedure, a ritual, an extraction designed to leave no trace while reinforcing fear. Every movement, every decision, every human being who vanished was part of a meticulous algorithm. And the most terrifying realization, the door did not merely erase, it trained. The living learned from the dead. Fear was passed on, encoded into the very behavior of the plantation. Elijah's pulse quickened. He understood now that he was not just observing a secret, he was inheriting it. To see the door's purpose was to become a part of its history, to carry the knowledge that could never be spoken aloud. The shadows around the alcove seemed to pulse with expectation, as if the darkness itself was aware of his awareness. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "Curiosity is survival, but survival has a price."